Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Aiden Mendez, and my topic here, as was said before, is the evolution and importance of education for people of color. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of this topic, I want all of you to just close your eyes for one short moment and picture one simple yet important question. What does an ideal education look like? Now, though we have all been conditioned into thinking that the grades on pieces of paper, from tests, from classwork, from homework, from special projects, whatever those may be, that is what entails our intelligence and our capability. Now, regardless of what we've been told to believe, real education, as we know, comes from fruitful yet personal experiences, regardless of how much of a formal education that you are able to receive. Two very significant examples of personal experiences defining the extent of their intelligence are a man named Benjamin Montgomery, who was born and raised a slave black man in the South of America. He was able to experience what it was like to be a slave laborer on a plantation for all of his childhood, being separated from most of his family. The average slave experience was no education whatsoever. Yet it was his personal experiences that defined his capability. He was able to innovate some of the inventions for the steamboat. He was able to help propel the industry of slavery. He was able to propel and perpetuate the capabilities of transportation of goods throughout the South. Another great example of this was Miss Marie Van Britten Brown, who was a young black woman who was born, raised, and lived most of her life throughout Southside, Jamaica, Queens, and New York City. And in her experiences growing up in a very dangerous, impoverished neighborhood, she was able to look at the dangers that herself and her neighbors had to be aware of at all times. She was able to create America's first home security system. And in creating this invention, she's been able to help bring many of you, I'm sure, a great deal of protection from people like burglars, from people like robbers, and all sorts of different types of criminals. Now, looking at the different types of education that Americans of color have received, it has always been a severely diminished extent. We look at the very beginning of education for Americans of color, particularly freed black slaves. We look at these glorified barnyards and warehouses full of practically beat up and destroyed old desks with a few textbooks thrown to the side to throw them a bone, and the absolute bare minimum that they had to give them to qualify it as this formal education. As time progressed, we saw into the Jim Crow era the separate but equal standards which separated white education with colored education. We saw more Hispanic American immigrants experiencing this same diminished formal education. As we see here, we can see the level of overpopulation and underfunding experienced in so many schools with predominantly colored students, while white students were able to experience this full formal education. Now, as we progress a few decades into the future, we can very easily see how the stereotypes have been formed about all these communities, about people of color, where many students who have failing grades and who drop out of school and who have absolutely no drive for success whatsoever happen to be black and brown students. Now, it all comes back from the very beginning of given the bare minimum amount of resources and given absolutely no clue what to do with it. From this diminished level of formal education, we can see the school-to-prison pipeline. Now, many of you may know about this, many of you may not, but these students of color with this very diminished level of education were pushed into so many other means of supporting their families and having this successful lifestyle. Many students were driven into dropping out of school and working on farms and plantations in the early days of colored education. Over time, many other students were forced to pursue crime as a measure of supporting their family, things like selling drugs, things like prostitution. All of these things that we have been raised into believing are completely wrong, no matter what, were what our people were forced into doing. we can see so many of the different types of statistics that we look at today that represent black and brown students, adults, of many different kinds of relationships and households. We can look at higher incarceration rates. We can look at higher dropout rates. We look at higher poverty rates. All of the things that define our people for what? To be labeled as failures. One of the things that severely perpetuates this level of failure in the school system for students of color is the zero tolerance policy, which essentially leaves students such as students of color, low-income students, students with disabilities, and LGBT students in the margin of people where as soon as something happens, as soon as you make the most minuscule of mistakes, there is no room left to grow from it. Especially when it's any kind of physical violence, there is no room left to learn. It is only punishment and failure. We can see that without the zero tolerance policy standard, black students are already double as likely to be suspended for whatever mistakes that they may be doing. But along with the zero tolerance policy, it only perpetuates the statistic. There is no benefit to this. We look at going back to this school to prison pipeline, there's only a 13% population count of black citizens in America, yet they make up 38.6% of America's population. We look at a 19% Hispanic population, yet they make 29.5% of the American population in the outside world, or in the prison system, excuse me. We look at so many students who are driven to dropping out of school in means to support their family or to support whatever dreams that they build up over time because they have no stability in the household, nor in the education system itself. These students drop out and in turn create such an incredibly high level of poverty. Students who drop out of high school and never get their diploma or just get their GED are already far less inclined to be considered middle or upper class. And that only continues with the extra levels of formal education. As we can see here, with each level of formal education that you receive, you are far more inclined to get a higher budget lifestyle, the luxuries of life that many people of color aren't able to afford for themselves or their children. Now, how have all these standards and statistics played into my life? Well, I was born initially, as Mr. Drysdale said, into a household of initially low income and only one parent. I was raised by my mother since birth, and there have been many different types of troubles that I've been forced to face by myself or just with my mother there. Though I've experienced education both in the Bronx, in the inner city, and I've experienced it here in Ossining, New York, I've been able to see the different levels of students who are driven to failure, who are driven to this statistic of dropping out or of not trying at all, of skipping class and doing absolutely nothing with their lives and being labeled as nothing but a failure. I was very close to being marked as one of those students. Just last year, I was a student with incredibly low grades, with the bare minimum that's required to be considered a passing student. Yet now I've been able to grow from so many different types of mentors. After grabbing onto so many different resources, I've been able to see what I'm capable of. Unlike many other students of color out there, many other students, black, brown, Latino, African American, are unable to recognize their potential and their intelligence simply because of the percentage put on a piece of paper. And from that, we are only taught to look at the result rather than the cause. So I urge all educators, all students, to look back to this root cause, to look back to the barnyards that our brothers and sisters were taught in back in the 18th century, to look back in these underfunded schools taught through into the Jim Crow era, and to look at the schools now, to look at how your kids are being inspired into being the best that they can be. And educators, promise yourselves that you will be able to relate and to empathize with your students as much as possible, because if it is not you, then there may not be any sort of adult figure there in their life to propel them to their maximum potential. And so, with one final quote to leave you off with, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. from South Africa's first black president, a man who's faced much adversity, Mr. Nelson Mandela. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Aiden Mendez.